You're still fighting the same garden battles every weekend. Watering daily because the soil won't hold moisture. Weeding constantly because bare ground is an open invitation. Replanting crops that bolt or get destroyed by pests before you harvest a single meal. You're spending money on amendments, spending time on maintenance, and getting barely enough food to justify the effort. Here's what most people miss. The problem isn't your work ethic, or your soil, or even your climate. The problem is you're gardening backwards. Modern advice tells you to plant in spring, when pests are already active, when heat stress is building, when competition for water is peak. January isn't a dead month. It's the smartest planting window you're ignoring. These 14 crops will feed your family all year if you stop waiting for spring. Think about it. Every spring, you're told to plant when garden centers say it's time, when the last frost passes, when retail inventory arrives, when everyone else is planting. That timing isn't based on what works for your crops or your soil. It's based on selling you the same solutions to the same problems you'll face all summer. But here's the reality. Indigenous food systems didn't follow retail calendars. They observed natural cycles and planted during dormancy when every advantage was already stacked in their favor. January planting isn't about forcing crops to survive harsh conditions. It's about leveraging cold season benefits that disappear the moment spring warmth arrives. When you plant in January, your crops root into cool, moist soil that hasn't been baked dry by summer heat. Competition for water is non-existent because most plants are dormant. Pests that destroy your spring and summer crops, aphids, caterpillars, beetles, are either dormant or absent entirely. Your crops get weeks or even months to establish deep root systems, build cold tolerance, and form relationships with soil biology before the growing season intensifies. By the time your neighbors are transplanting fragile seedlings into hot soil and battling immediate pest pressure, your January planted crops are already mature, resilient, and productive. This is the design advantage modern gardening ignores because it can't be sold in a bottle. Here's what most people miss. January planting isn't just about timing. It's about designing a system that works through relationships instead of intervention. Modern monoculture gardens require you to be the pest manager, the irrigation system, the nutrient supplier, and the problem solver, because you've designed a system that depends entirely on your labor. Indigenous polyculture systems functioned the opposite way. They planted crops that performed multiple roles: nitrogen fixers that fed neighbors, deep-rooted plants that broke compaction, ground covers that suppressed weeds and held moisture, companion plants that confused pests and attracted beneficials. These weren't random pairings. They were observed relationships that reduced labor and increased reliability. You're not learning ancient history. You're learning how to stop working weekends. Now let's talk about what actually thrives when you plant in January and why these specific crops transform your garden from a chore into a self-regulating system. Garlic is the first crop, and it does more than just produce bulbs. Planted in fall or early winter, garlic roots establish during dormancy and spend months building size before spring growth accelerates. But garlic isn't just productive on its own. It's a pest deterrent that disrupts feeding patterns for aphids, beetles, and even rabbits. Plant garlic as a border around your beds, or intersperse it with carrots, beets, and greens. The compounds it releases through its roots actively suppress fungal pathogens in the soil, which means your neighboring crops face fewer disease pressures without you applying a single treatment. You're not just growing garlic, you're installing a protective system. Fava beans are a nitrogen-fixing powerhouse that most American gardeners ignore because they're not part of the standard spring lineup. But fava beans thrive in cool temperatures and actually struggle in heat, which makes them perfect for January planting. As they grow, Their roots host bacteria that pull atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into plant-available forms. When you chop fava bean plants at the base and leave the roots in the ground, you're not just clearing space, you're injecting fertility directly into your soil for the next crop. Fava beans also produce dense foliage that shades the soil, suppresses weeds, and retains moisture. Pair them with early greens like spinach or lettuce underneath their canopy, and you've created a living mulch system that eliminates bare soil and reduces watering frequency. This is what relationships look like in practice. Onions planted from sets in January establish slowly through winter and size up rapidly in spring. They're another allium that serves double duty as a pest deterrent and a productive crop. Onions pair well with carrots because their strong scent masks the carrot smell that attracts carrot rust flies. Plant them in alternating rows or intermixed clusters, and you've built in pest confusion without sprays or row covers. Onions are also space efficient and low maintenance. Once established, they require minimal water and tolerate crowding better than most crops, which makes them ideal for small spaces or intensive beds where every square foot matters. Carrots are cold hardy and actually sweeten in flavor when exposed to frost. January planted carrots root deeply during the cool season, which improves their drought tolerance later in the year. Deep-rooted crops like carrots also break up compacted soil layers naturally, creating channels for water infiltration and air exchange that benefit everything you plant after them. Pair carrots with nitrogen-fixing fava beans or alliums like garlic and onions, and you've created a complementary system where each plant improves conditions for the others. Carrots also produce ferny foliage that provides light shade for low-growing greens, which extends their productive season before they bolt in heat. Beets are another root crop that thrives in cool soil and benefits from early planting. Beet greens are edible and productive long before the roots reach full size, which gives you 2 harvests from 1 planting. Beets tolerate crowding and can be succession planted every few weeks to stagger harvests. Their dense foliage shades soil, suppresses weeds, and adds organic matter when chopped and dropped in place. Beets also tolerate partial shade, which makes them excellent understory crops beneath taller plants like fava beans or later season corn. You're not just growing beets, you're layering functions. Spinach planted in January produces tender greens through late winter and early spring, then bolts when temperatures rise. But here's where it gets interesting. Even bolted spinach serves a purpose if you design for it. Let the plants flower and self-seed, and you'll have volunteer spinach appearing in fall without replanting. Spinach also tolerates partial shade better than most greens, which makes it an ideal understory crop beneath taller plants. Plant spinach under fava beans or between rows of garlic, and you're using vertical space efficiently while creating a living mulch that shades soil and retains moisture. Spinach roots are shallow and fibrous, which means they don't compete with deeper-rooted crops like carrots or beets for nutrients or water. This is how you design layers instead of battles. Lettuce is another cool season green that thrives in January and provides quick returns. Succession plant lettuce every 2 weeks, and you'll have continuous harvests from late winter through spring. Lettuce is also one of the easiest crops to grow in containers, which makes it ideal for patios, balconies, or small yards where ground space is limited. Pair lettuce with taller crops that provide afternoon shade, and you'll extend its productive season before heat triggers bolting. Lettuce roots are shallow, so it pairs well with deeper-rooted crops that mine nutrients from lower soil layers. When lettuce bolts, chop it at the base and leave the roots in place. The decomposing roots feed soil biology and add organic matter exactly where your next crop will grow. You're building fertility while you harvest. Kale is cold hardy, productive, and nearly indestructible once established. January planted kale produces tender leaves through winter and spring, then continues producing through summer if you harvest regularly and provide shade during peak heat. But here's what most people miss. Kale also functions as a living mulch. Its broad leaves shade soil, suppress weeds, and reduce evaporation, which cuts your watering frequency significantly. Kale tolerates crowding and can be planted densely in polyculture beds where space is limited. When kale plants become too large or woody, chop them at the base and leave the stems and leaves on the soil surface as mulch. The decomposing plant matter feeds soil biology, adds organic matter, and creates habitat for beneficial insects. You're not removing waste. You're cycling resources. Arugula is a fast-growing green that thrives in cool temperatures and actually develops a milder, less peppery flavor when grown in winter. Plant arugula in January, and you'll be harvesting leaves within 3 to 4 weeks. Arugula also self-seeds aggressively, which means one planting can provide volunteer crops for years if you let a few plants flower and go to seed. Arugula pairs well with alliums like garlic and onions because the strong scents confuse pests that target greens. Arugula roots are shallow and fibrous, so it doesn't compete with deeper-rooted crops. When arugula bolts, let it flower. The blossoms attract pollinators and beneficial insects, and the seeds will drop and germinate when conditions are right. You plant once. The system replants itself. Chard is another cold-tolerant green that produces heavily from a single planting. Chard tolerates frost, heat, and partial shade, which makes it one of the most versatile crops you can grow. Plant chard in January, and you'll harvest leaves continuously through spring, summer, and fall. Chard also produces colorful stems, red, yellow, orange, white, that add visual interest to polyculture beds and make it easier to distinguish between crop types when plants are young. Chard roots are moderately deep, so it pairs well with shallow-rooted greens and deep-rooted crops, like carrots. When chard plants become too large, chop them at the base and use the leaves as mulch or add them directly to the soil surface. You're feeding the system that feeds you. Peas are nitrogen-fixing legumes that thrive in cool temperatures and produce edible pods, shoots, and flowers. January planted peas establish slowly through winter and produce heavily in early spring before heat shuts them down. Peas climb, which means they use vertical space efficiently and can be trained on trellises, fences, or even taller companion plants like corn or sunflowers planted later in the season. As peas grow, their roots fix nitrogen and improve soil fertility for subsequent crops. When peas finish producing, chop the plants at the base and leave the roots in the ground. The nitrogen stored in root nodules becomes available to the next crop as the roots decompose. You're not just growing peas, you're building soil for everything that comes after. Radishes are fast-growing roots that break up compacted soil and produce edible roots and greens within 3 to 4 weeks. Radishes planted in January mature quickly and can be succession planted every 2 weeks for continuous harvests. But here's the real function. Radishes also serve as trap crops for flea beetles and other pests that target greens. Plant radishes as a border crop around slower-growing plants like kale or cabbage, and pests will target the radishes first, giving your main crops time to establish and build defenses. Radish roots are tap roots that penetrate compacted soil layers, creating channels for water infiltration and air exchange. When radishes bolt, let them flower. The blooms attract pollinators, and the seed pods are edible and flavorful. Every part of the plant serves a purpose. Parsnips are slow-growing roots that actually improve in flavor after exposure to frost. Plant parsnips in January, and they'll spend months developing deep tap roots that mine nutrients and break compaction in lower soil layers. Parsnips tolerate neglect better than most crops and require minimal water once established. They also overwinter well, which means you can leave them in the ground and harvest as needed through winter and early spring. Parsnips pair well with nitrogen-fixing legumes because they're heavy feeders that benefit from the fertility legumes provide. You're not just planting parsnips, you're designing nutrient exchange between crops. Even if you're stuck with a small yard, a patio, or HOA restrictions that limit what you can plant, these crops scale to containers and raised beds without losing their self-regulating benefits. The principles don't change. You're still building polyculture relationships, still designing systems that reduce labor, still creating microclimates that extend productive seasons. A 5-gallon container can support a combination of lettuce, radishes, and garlic. A 10-gallon container can handle kale, spinach, and onions planted together. Larger containers or raised beds can accommodate layered systems where deep-rooted crops like carrots and parsnips share space with shallow-rooted greens and nitrogen-fixing legumes. The key is designing for relationships instead of isolation. Single crop containers require you to manage every input: water, nutrients, pest control. Polyculture containers create their own microclimates where taller plants shade soil, where legumes feed neighbors, where alliums deter pests, and where residues build fertility in place without you hauling compost. Here's what most people miss about container growing. Soil volume matters less than soil biology. A small container with active microbial life, diverse root systems, and continuous organic matter inputs will outperform a large container with sterile potting mix and single crop monocultures every time. When you plant multiple species together, their roots release different compounds that feed different microbial populations. Those microbes break down organic matter, cycle nutrients, suppress pathogens, and improve soil structure. You're not just growing crops, you're cultivating an ecosystem that becomes more productive and more resilient over time. This is why indigenous systems didn't rely on amendments or fertilizers. They designed for biological activity that built fertility as a byproduct of growth, not as an input you purchase. Water management in containers follows the same logic. Monoculture containers dry out quickly because bare soil evaporates moisture, and single root systems can't access water held in different soil layers. Polyculture containers retain moisture longer because dense foliage shades soil, because diverse root systems access water at different depths, and because organic matter from plant residues improves water holding capacity over time. Plant lettuce under kale, and the kale shades the lettuce while the lettuce shades the soil. Plant radishes with carrots, and the radish foliage provides early season ground cover while the carrots establish deeper roots. Every plant in the system contributes to water retention, which means you're watering less frequently without sacrificing productivity. You're designing efficiency, not dependency. Now let's talk about the final crops that complete this system: perennials and self-seeders that return year after year without replanting. Asparagus is the ultimate perennial vegetable. Plant asparagus crowns in January, and they'll establish roots through the first year, then produce edible spears every spring for the next 20 years or more. Asparagus requires patience initially, but once established, it's nearly maintenance-free. Asparagus roots are deep and extensive, which makes them excellent soil builders. The ferny foliage that grows after the spring harvest shades soil, suppresses weeds, and adds organic matter when it dies back in fall. Asparagus also tolerates partial shade and can be planted along fence lines or in spots where other crops struggle. You plant once, you harvest for decades. Rhubarb is another perennial that produces heavily with minimal care once established. Plant rhubarb crowns in January, and they'll establish slowly through the first year, then produce edible stalks every spring for decades. Rhubarb leaves are large and toxic, which makes them excellent pest deterrents and mulch material. The decomposing leaves add organic matter and suppress weeds naturally. Rhubarb tolerates cold, heat, and neglect, which makes it ideal for low-maintenance food systems. This is what perennials offer: front-loaded work that pays dividends for years without replanting. Walking onions are perennial onions that produce both edible bulbs and top sets, small bulbs that form at the top of the stalk. When the top sets mature, they bend the stalk to the ground and replant themselves, which is why they're called walking onions. Plant walking onions once, and they'll spread gradually and provide continuous harvests without replanting. Walking onions are cold-hardy, pest-resistant, and nearly indestructible once established. Egyptian onions function similarly and produce top sets that replant themselves. They're perennial, cold-hardy, and require minimal maintenance. Both types serve as living mulch, pest deterrents, and continuous food sources that eliminate replanting entirely. You install them. They propagate themselves. Sorrel is a perennial green with a tart, lemony flavor. Plant sorrel once, and it returns every spring for years. Sorrel tolerates shade, cold, and poor soil, which makes it ideal for difficult spots where other crops struggle. Sorrel leaves are edible raw or cooked and add flavor to salads, soups, and sauces. Sorrel also self-seeds, so volunteer plants will appear if you let a few stalks flower and go to seed. This is the pattern, designed for self-propagation, and you stop replanting. Seed saving closes the loop and turns your garden into a truly autonomous system. When you let crops like arugula, lettuce, radishes, and spinach flower and go to seed, you're not just generating free seeds for future plantings. You're selecting for plants that thrive in your specific conditions, your soil, your climate, your watering patterns, your pest pressures. Over time, your saved seeds will outperform anything you buy because they've adapted to your garden through natural selection. Seed saving also eliminates dependency on seed companies and garden centers, which means you're building resilience and autonomy into your food system. You're not buying inputs, you're designing self-sufficiency. Stop paying garden centers to fix problems your design created. They profit when you replant the same crops every year, when you fight the same pests every summer, when you buy amendments to fix soil that was never designed to build fertility in the first place. Indigenous systems didn't operate that way. They observed relationships, timed labor to align with natural advantages, and designed polycultures that became more productive over time through embedded processes, soil building, self-seeding, pest confusion, water retention. January planting isn't about surviving cold. It's about installing a system that regulates itself while you're not watching. Plant these 14 crops now. Step back. Let relationships do the work you've been doing manually for years. Stop fighting. Design the exit. Reclaim your weekend.